The US and NATO have formally rejected Moscow's sweeping security demands, refusing, among other things, to rule out future NATO membership for Ukraine. In its written reply to Moscow's proposals, Washington offers what it calls a serious diplomatic path out of the crisis. In recent weeks, Russia has massed some 100,000 troops near its border with Ukraine, stirring fears of an attack.
A military exercise on the Ukrainian border. Russia is flexing its muscles, while Washington has handed over a written response to Moscow's demands.
Our response to Russia reflects what I said in Kyiv, Berlin, and Geneva last week. We're open to dialogue. We prefer diplomacy. And we're prepared to move forward where there is the possibility of communication and cooperation if Russia de-escalates its aggression toward Ukraine, stops the inflammatory rhetoric, and approaches discussions about the future of security in Europe in a spirit of reciprocity. Our responses were fully coordinated with Ukraine and our European allies and partners, with whom we've been consulting continuously for weeks.
The response was delivered personally by the US ambassador to Russia. Moscow wants NATO to close its doors to Ukraine, something Washington is firmly opposed to. NATO has also sent a written reply rejecting Moscow's demands.
While we are hoping for and working for a good solution, de-escalation, we are also prepared for the worst. And therefore, in parallel with our efforts on the dialogue track, we are also increasing the readiness of our forces, and NATO allies have also increased the presence, partly to conduct surveillance, to monitor, to have the best possible picture of the developments in and around Ukraine, but also to provide reassurance to allies.
In Paris, there was diplomacy at a lower level. The Normandy format brought Germany, France, Russia and Ukraine together for another round of talks.
The very fact that the work of the Normandy format has resumed is a very positive signal. We had really very comprehensive talks, though they weren't easy. Let's call it an audit of where we are today. The next meeting will take place soon, maybe even in 2 weeks, and it will take place in Berlin. We agreed to continue our dialogue.
As the US and its allies wrestle with Russia's demands, a frosty atmosphere spreads along Ukraine's border.
Well, let's cross straight over to our Moscow correspondent, Emily Sherwin. Emily, Washington says the U.S. is making no concessions to Russia's main demands regarding Ukraine and NATO. How is that going down in Moscow?
Well, we heard a short response from the Deputy Foreign Minister, Alexander Grushko, yesterday, who said that Russia would study the written response that it received. And he also said, you know, look, our partners, NATO and the U.S., took around 1.5 months to respond. So essentially giving Russia some time to respond as well. In that short response, we haven't heard from the Kremlin yet. And actually, Vladimir Putin himself has been conspicuously quiet on the whole issue of Ukraine in the last month or so. Of course, the fact that NATO and the U.S. have rejected Russia's main demand, which is a stop to NATO expansion, Eastern expansion, that's bad news for Russia. But I think that Russia went into all these rounds of talks that we've seen in the last few weeks, essentially knowing that a stop to NATO Eastern expansion is a non-starter for the U.S. and for NATO, which is what they've heard again and again over the past few weeks. So essentially, it's Russia taking, playing a high-stakes game of poker, including with these troops on the border. But I do think some of the things that the West has offered Russia in the past few weeks are perhaps of interest. Talks on arms control, mutual guarantees, and transparency on military exercises. exercises. The question now is, what do they do when they haven't had their main demand met,
Right.
without losing face? What can they really do?
Indeed, a high-stakes game. The question, of course, is what's going to happen now with Moscow's main security demands formally rejected? Is Moscow more likely to launch an incursion into Ukraine?
Well, that short response that we saw from the foreign ministry certainly doesn't seem like the Russian side will take any rash decisions. They're going to be looking very carefully at what they've been offered in that written response. I think the Russian position all along has been that they're not planning an attack. And indeed, I think a war with Ukraine, a full-out all-out war, would be unpopular here at home. Many Russians have family ties with Ukraine, so I think that isn't something that they want. But the military threat is certainly on the table, with exercises planned, joint exercises with Belarus in the coming weeks.
Emily, thank you very much. Our Moscow correspondent, Emily Sherwin. Well, for some further analysis on this story, let's bring in Eckhard Brose. He's president of Germany's Federal Academy for Security Policy. That's a government think tank. He's also a former ambassador and served as both diplomat in Moscow and Washington. Ambassador Brose, thanks for joining us. First of all, give us your threat assessment here. How likely is it that Russian troops will launch an offensive in Ukraine?
Good morning, Terry. I think we need to take that threat seriously. How likely it is, perhaps only Putin knows. He keeps us guessing. Preparations are ongoing, and we need to work on the assumptions that these preparations have some meaning, and the meaning is there is a threat. So let's take it seriously, but at the same time, we pursue, as we just heard, very actively, the other path, namely that of diplomacy and negotiations.
So the threat is serious, you say. The U.S. and some European countries see it that way, too. They're bolstering Ukraine's defenses by delivering weapons to Ukraine. Now, Germany is refusing to do that and has reportedly blocked Estonia from sending German-made weapons to Ukraine. Why?
First of all, the weapons that you refer to, these formerly GDR weapons, are a limited number of old weapons. Indeed, it is questionable whether they will make a difference or not to the ability of Ukraine to defend itself. So let's not, it's a red herring, I think.
You're referring
what
to
you
the
rightly
weapons
say
from
is that
Estonia.
Germany...
You're referring to the
what you
weapons
rightly...
from Estonia? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
No, go ahead. Sorry, Ambassador.
What you're rightly pointing out is that the US and Britain in particular are delivering weapons to Ukraine. Germany is not. The government has explained that that is primarily due to its history with Russia, with the Soviet Union. I think other countries could accept that and could accept the fact that not every country in this Western alliance has to do exactly the same thing. What matters really is that everybody is pulling in the same direction. And Germany is very firmly part of this Western alliance, very firmly also part of this deterrence front that consists of all these countries. We have put economic sanctions, for example, firmly on the table.
Berlin's response, though, to Russia's military buildup and security demands is widely regarded as ambiguous. What impact is that having on Germany's credibility with its allies?
I think some of the voices we've heard in written commentary, for example, has been simply exaggerated. I think if you look at the sequence of events, NATO meetings, NATO-Russia meeting, EU meetings, G7 meetings, all of these Germany was part of. We agreed with the US, with our other allies, on how to proceed. We have detailed talks about economic sanctions and other ways to make clear and send a signal to Russia and to Putin that we mean business and we're going to stand our ground. And I think Germany is firmly part of this group. So anybody who thinks that that's not the case, I think, is misreading and misinterpreting the signals.
Ambassador Broza, thank you very much for talking with us. That was security analyst Eckhard Broza.
Thank you.